thinking in social networks is that entrepreneurs or innovators are those who are taxing flows, those who are on the right pathways, and something is flowing, and entrepreneurs are taking an advantage of that. Well, what we try to propose as a rethinking is that instead of flows, we think of alliances and stronger short-distance ties where things are not flowing easily. Why would business networks be used as a medium for things that flow easily? Why don't you use something else? Facebook, the internet, mobile phone networks, whatever communication channels you have for easily flowing, kind of durably mobile pieces of information. You have embedded networks of alliances for those things that do not flow readily. Tacit knowledge, reciprocation, trust, and a generation of a dictionary or a language of your own that facilitates a smooth working together, but it only works at a short distance in that locality. And trust and access is an important concern. Why would these people in those little grouplets, let's say those are business groups, trust this intermediary in the middle with their tacit information, the knowledge that they developed, reciprocation, anything? Why would they hand it on to an outsider? So something that flows in that little group and passes on to other groups, yes, that's fine. A broker or a bridge person can take a benefit out of those flows, maybe financial flows, maybe some rumors, something that circulates. But things that are not easily, durably circulating, the brokers will never take advantage of. So we conceptualize this as the notion of intercohesion, structural folding. We're still wondering about the terminology here. We know that there are important processes going on within cohesive groups in social networks, such as homophily, the attraction of similars, the group size is an important factor, how much you can communicate and share, how much you can manage or lead the group, and power, who is more powerful, less powerful within the group. So there's a lot of research on group dynamics, which is group dynamics is a literature about what's happening within a group, how decisions are made, is there smooth communication, is there breakdown, is there something achieved, and so on. There are lots of things about extra cohesive processes in a broader network. How are the flows? Who are taxing them? Are people reachable? How soon something propagates? A rumor, a flow of money, a piece of innovation adopted along the network. Those are things that flow, and we need to look at the whole network to understand that. But we argue that there are intercohesive processes, or processes that involve the overlapping of cohesive structures in the network, where you have multiple insiders joining together social structures, not just brokers that are hinging on the periphery of two groups, but people who are truly members and fully members of multiple structures. And they are connecting these groups together in a fashion that you have new combinations that are possibly coming out of this. Now, these people might also be tension points in these structures, and that's something that we try to explore in our data set. What we look at, the particular case, is the case of the post-socialist business groups, how post-socialist companies founded for the first time in 1988, January 1st, that's when the legal form became a possibility, corporate legal form, and how they started to build up their network ties with new building blocks. There were no boards of directors or share ownerships. So the building blocks that we take for granted in a capitalist economy were brand new in 1988, January 1st. So we can look at the network as it builds up from zero. Of course, people were there, companies were there, but they didn't have these tools. And we see how they build a network with new tools. This is also an epoch of profound transformation. So if you talk about a system that is in some kind of a shock, here you had a system with 100% state ownership at the beginning, 98%. that goes to 12% today, or at the end of this period that we studied. Foreign ownership increased from 0.5% to more than 60% now, or close to 70%. And an orientation from the Comic-Con, the communist market structure, was completely dismantled, and there is a global integration into European and global production chains. We have a substantial coverage of a small economy. We collect data on companies that cover about 80% of the GDP, of export revenues, half of the GDP, and more than a third of employment here. Now, something a little more about the data set. We tried to identify a historical firm population. If you're interested in a historical network development, you cannot just take a look at a cross-section in the end or in the beginning, because you will censor the data in some way. So what we tried to do is to pick any company that managed to belong to the top 500 at least once in its history between 1987 and 2001. That gave us about 1,700 companies. And we follow their full history from the first moments when we find them to a bankruptcy or to the end of the epoch. So data comes from the registry courts. We collect the names of senior managers, board members, supervisory board members, about 120,000 names in all. And we connect this to a network data set of companies connected through these personal affiliations. And here we just use an annual time resolution. And this is how the network is building up. You see that there's 87 is already there when banks were formed. And 88 is when companies were able to transform or started using these corporate tools to network. And the growth was rather quick to about 93, 94, and then it plateaued. And we have about 900 firms stably connected in the network. Of course, it's not the same 900 firms, so there's some dynamic change going on. So the first challenge is, how do we identify the cohesive groups in a historical data set? It's a challenge because most methods look at the whole network to identify the relatively dense parts, and that doesn't work for a historical purpose. What we want to have is to identify cohesive groups in a way that if there's no change in the locality of these companies, their networks, there shouldn't be a change in the classification of their cohesive group belonging, regardless of how the environment, network environment, became much denser or much sparser. But if once we identify them as a group, we should be able to follow them if they don't change their connections. And also we try to have non-exclusive groups or allow for overlapping groups. So we use this method from physics called the clique percolation method. It's identifying cohesive clusters is a hot topic these days in network science. Someone counted 103 methods of identifying cohesive groups. So we use one of those 103, which we found feasible and usable for our purposes. Okay, I don't think I have time to really go into the details here, but the point is that we identify these groups in a way that they can overlap, and they do overlap. So just a cross-section from 1995, you see these dots. The gray dots are companies that belong to only one group, and the black ones are those who belong to multiple groups, and only 12 groups are exclusive of the 53. So the overlapping is the rule, not the exception, in the business networks that we study. What we do next is that we connect these group histories in time so that we can identify the life cycles or the durability, robustness, or resilience of particular groups in time in a historical data set. The first question is, how do groups perform? And this is an important question because we are interested in entrepreneurial success. We try to capture that, some kind of performance indicator, and relate that to the network structure. There's a whole discussion on what indicator to choose. which I will not go into. The point is that we use revenue growth, the ability to capture markets, to grow your markets, as opposed to lose your markets or shrink the revenues. Everything else is manipulated and subject to profits, and those things are subject to just what looks nice on the annual report. The independent variables that we use here to predict this revenue growth, of course, is intercohesion or structural folding, which we expect to be enhancing the capacity of business groups to capture markets. And then a host of other dimensions, which I will just mention in the table if they come out as significant, but basically we control for things in the larger network environment and then within the group, power inequities and things like that. So this table shows a prediction whether the group that we look at belongs to the highest growing top 25%. We use this because revenue growth is extremely skewed. So we took this approach. It works with the top 10%, the top 30%, the top 5%. So however you cut it, the prediction works the same way. And you see that intercohesion, the overlap, the amount of overlaps that a group has. Now groups are the units of observation here. So the amount that they overlap increases the probability that they can grow their markets, that they can get more revenues. And it's also true that stability, which is another maybe resilience in the smaller group level, is something that is negatively related to declining revenue. So if you have a stable group, not changing, it can protect you from losing markets. So if you don't change your team, you're maybe less at risk of losing something, of dropping a part of the market or losing a part of your business. So there's these two things. One is overlapping gets you the possibility to go up, to obtain markets, and then stability is to keep markets. Now the next step, what we found is interesting, is that group stability, the question was, how does group stability predict it? And one expectation is that, well, the overlaps themselves might be destabilizing groups. So this kind of practice that you form these overlaps to combine things, to learn from other groups, and to recombine into new practices that gets you the new market, might also be the same thing that makes you more unstable, maybe less resilient, and you fall apart and you risk losing those markets. So that kind of interplay was in our minds, and this is our way of operationalizing resilience at the group level. What's the proportion of the group staying together from T1 to T2, from year one to the next year? And these are just two examples when you have a complete disintegration of a small group or a relatively high stability. Three of them stay together of the four, for example. So when we look at this, yes, we find that the number of overlaps, intercohesion, or structural folding is negatively related to group stability. So the more overlapping in a group, the more disintegration that's happening in the group. What is interesting here is that we did this prediction with leaving out the companies that are actually the multiple group members. Because one expectation is that if you have a group that has one or two or three firms being members of other groups as well at the same time, well, they have the option maybe to explore, I'm in multiple groups because I want to choose which one fits me better, and those ones leave the group. Well, it turns out not to be the case, or it's not only the only explanation, because the remaining companies that are just member of that one group are falling apart more likely if there are other companies with multiple group memberships. So it's not just the kind of opportunistic keeping your multiple irons in the fire or something. It's a little more than that. It's a breakdown. It's a lack of resilience of overlapping groups. This is something I will just go through very quickly. We did a simulation test. What would you expect at the random network change for robustness for overlapping and non-overlapping groups? And this is just a small visualization of how we did the rewiring of these networks. And yes, you find that there's a negative correlation between overlaps and stability even in a random network change. But what we observe is actually more negative. So there's something more than just the exposure to the degradation of the network if you have overlaps. Because to have overlaps, you need a lot of ties. And if you have a lot of ties, you're more likely at risk to lose some of those ties in the random network change. But it's not the only explanation. There's some added breakdown of overlapping communities. So far it's a relatively negative picture. If you have these combinations, overlapping groups, you are basically decomposing the network. You erode the network by these split loyalties. But what is interesting when we're thinking about, well, where are those business groups that we know? We know that there are stable, resilient, long-standing, maybe 20 or 100-year-old business groups. For example, in Germany or Austria, there are much longer histories of capitalist forms of enterprise. Where are those? Because we know about, even in Hungary, business groups that are together for 5, 10 years. So we looked at a little broader, we zoomed out to a little broader communities, and in these visualizations you have groups as the nodes, and the links are number of companies that go down from T1 to T2 from one group to the next. It's like inheriting members. So in this is first a picture on the left-hand side, the red dots. Try to show it there as well. So that picture over there is an example of an exclusive group. It's highly resilient. Companies are staying together. The other side, those pink nodes show a story when you have multiple groups. There's a split. There's recombination, 2, 3 groups recombining members in a historical sequence. And this is where we found our resilient business groups. It turns out that the business groups are not these cohesive groups that we identify, but sets of 2, 3, 4 cohesive groups, usually overlapping, recombining from year to year or from once every 2 years, because of these instabilities, but nevertheless these recombinations are staying within a lineage structure, and this is what turns out to be the proper business groups, these lineage structures, that in some instances we have the names of the companies that are all the same. So the first part signifies a business group belonging. It's an exception because these are not institutionalized business groups in Hungary, and that is kind of a test of this idea that we all have those. All of those companies are in the lineage and none of them are somewhere else. Now, if you take a simulation test, what would it look like if companies, when the overlapping groups break down, go their own ways, they part, it's a breakup, and they are free to go wherever they want? How would these lineages look like in a rewired scenario? This is just a quick demonstration of how the rewiring is done. So we keep the degree distributions at each T the same. This is what you would get. The largest cluster is a huge mesh of 90% of the companies are there, just moving randomly, and then you have these small isolated traces, very short histories in this data set. And of course, this is highly significant. So what we see, these resilient kind of lineages, broader groups, are very far from anything random. I think I would stop here and not discuss these particular case studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.